Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding, and today I'm continuing our series, working our way on an author's journey through the Lord of the Rings. And we have reached quite a long way into the Two Towers now. We are in Chapter 6 of Book 4. It's a chapter called The Forbidden Pool. And it comes just after the very long conversation with Faramir, which was the subject of our last episode. This, by contrast, is actually quite a short chapter, and it's really devoted to one incident, which is the arrival of Gollum as he's fishing in the pool for his favourite thing, which is fish, being pulled out of that by Frodo, and then the questioning under Faramir. And this all sets up the journey starting up again. So we're coming to the end of this little respite that Tolkien has given us in the darker material of this book. If you think about the Two Towers, the two parts of it, like some kind of tapestry or collection of colours, the first part is much more vibrant, which is why it's easier to read. You've got the forest colours of Fangorn, you've got the white and the green and the heraldic colours of Rohan and the horses and the armour. Any sort of grittiness, like the Battle of Helm's Deep or the abductions by the Uruk-hai of the two younger hobbits, those are leavened with lighter moments, a change of mood or cutting between characters. The second book, Book 4, which concentrates on Frodo and Sam, doesn't have the cutaway potential because they're together, but also it is a much darker place they're going through, and the effort and the strain is also dark and subject matter. So this episode of relaxation and respite in Ithilien is really important to make this readable. Otherwise, it would feel unbearably heavy as a piece. That's one of the reasons why I felt the film version of this actually doesn't live up to the book version. They did many great choices in the film, but I felt that that feeling of just being able to take a deep breath and enjoy meeting a new wise character in Faramir didn't come across in the film treatment. But yeah, they make choices because they've got to cram it all into a short few hours. Anyway, let's turn to what we're getting in this chapter. I would say that when I was reading it, I kept getting echoes of Shakespeare. So I think there is an element of Shakespeare haunting this chapter, which I hadn't really thought of before, but I'll point these out as we go along. So we get the sort of beginning of this is Faramir rousing Frodo from sleep. I just noticed there's lots of F's in this first very opening sentence. We got Frodo woke to... See, I'm already tripping up. Frodo woke to find Faramir bending over him. For a second, old fears seized him and he sat up and shrank away. It's almost like alliterative verse, all those F's. And here's a little sidebar. It doesn't matter with Frodo and Faramir, but on the whole, if you've got a cast of characters, it's quite good to separate out characters. Don't have too many with the same starting initial. It's difficult in a culture like Rohan, Éowyn, where it's a family reason, but just for ease of the eye reading across the page, it's a good idea to distinguish. So actually Tolkien has done this in the company, hasn't he? So we've got Frodo, Merry, Pippin and Sam all clearly distinguished by their names. So Fredegar couldn't come with them because his name's too much like Frodo. Anyway, I digress. So the details here of the moon over Ithilien and over Gondor, there's an interesting note in the companion to The Lord of the Rings that Tolkien was using a 1942 moon chart to time all of this. He has reference to the moon setting. It's only somebody who really observes his world very well who actually does more than just plonk the moon in the sky. I confess that I've been a bit lazy about that, and this is making me rethink that actually appealing to reality is a very good tip. So if it matters in your story, I don't think I've written one where it matters, but if it matters in your story and you're in a Earth-type location, looking at the real data on when a moonrise rises and when it sets and using that to pace out your book is great. Also because it suggests things which the real world suggests, which your brain might not. And here we get that in the effect of the light on the waterfall, which we'll come to in a second. And then again, when the moon is setting, which I can imagine Tolkien leafing through to the equivalent of early March and thinking, oh, that's a nice detail to put in. It was interesting after our alliterative F start, when Frodo does rise up from his sort of makeshift bed, it's full of short, stuttery sentences. It seemed cold in the fireless cave. The noise of the water was loud in the stillness. He put on his cloak and followed Faramir. Uncharacteristic for Tolkien to have short sentences like that all in a run. And it seems to me to convey that sense of the slowness of waking up. You're not quite fluent and fluid. You're just trying to get to grips, and your impressions are fleeting. So I think that's what he's capturing here. Sam follows, and it's Sam who actually gives us the first bit of poetry in this chapter, because he is the one who notices the beauty of the curtain. We're briefly in his point of view. I love this description. This waterfall has provided us with a beautiful image in the last chapter, and it comes back again here, because it's now a dazzling veil of silk and pearls and silver thread, melting icicles of moonlight. That last bit, going from a more literal, what do I see, the melting icicles of moonlight launches us into Sam's poetic grasp of what he's seeing, which is absolutely beautiful. So we follow Faramir outside up to this platform where you've got a view down into the pool. This is one of those areas, if you're following in the book, it's page 292 in the 3-volume version. It's very hard to describe things, surprisingly. How much information do you give? Well, when is it too much? Here, I think one of the things I noticed is that he does describe this small scene, not an important scene in the book in many ways, the place that they're standing. He uses something like what a landscape painter would do. And of course, Tolkien himself was a fine painter, amateur painter. You use the foreground to background or background to foreground or left to right. You organize your description. And that's what he's doing here. And he even does what a landscape painter traditionally did in the 18th century. He provides a point, an accent point. Very often it was like a twisted oak or something. Here, it ends up with a man stood there near the brink, silent, gazing down. So here's the last place where our eye rests. So if you're struggling with how to describe things, it might be worth just looking at this very short little passage and see what is being done, how to control, because you can see it perhaps in your mind's eye, if that's how your brain works, but you need to help the reader not feel overwhelmed by the detail, so you organize it for them. This leads us on to another of those characteristic Tolkienian moments, the high place moment, where it's Frodo now who's looking out across the landscape in front of him. I think this is doing 3 things. It's beautiful. It keeps that idea of the beauty of Middle-earth in the forefront of our mind, even though we're in the shadow of Mordor. It's grounding because we are there with Frodo. We feel present in the landscape. But also, it's connecting. So if I read you just a little bit of that. Far off in the west, the full moon was sinking round and white. There's that detail drawn from the lists. Pale mist shimmered in the great vale below, a wide gulf of silver fume, beneath which rolled the cool night waters of the Anduin. A black darkness loomed beyond, and in it glinted here and there, cold, sharp, remote, white as the teeth of ghosts, the peaks of Ered Nimrais, the white mountains of the realm of Gondor, tipped with everlasting snow. For a while Frodo stood there on the high stone, and a shiver ran through him, wondering if anywhere in the vastness of the Nightlands his old companions walked or slept, or lay dead shrouded in mist. So that's the connecting back to the story. We know more than he does. We know that, yes, all but Boromir are still alive, and they are indeed in that area that he's looking out on. But there's also some thematic connections being made. Did you notice that there's that odd description of the peaks being like the teeth of ghosts? Never really thought of ghosts having teeth. That seems to be the more of a skull thing. But we know what he's getting at, this ghostly pallor. But of course, pretty much around this time, we have Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli and the Grey Company actually going on the paths of the dead. So there's a nice connection there in the language being used. And again, we're talking about this being a well-woven tapestry, this book. That's another of these little threads that you may have missed, which is connecting the stories. And Faramir is the one who comes up and actually sort of speaks about the landscape. He talks about fair Ithil. He uses that word, the old word for the moon, which sets up the explanation which he later gives about Minas Ithil, Minas Morgul, as he says it is named. So that little note has already been planted. I really enjoyed reading this chapter because it's full of moments where I really enjoyed the language. The funny thing is, I don't think I've ever really given this chapter much thought before, because I know we're about to start the journey again. But I was struck by, for example, how Tolkien spends he makes his language count, even on something as small as watching Gollum dive into the pool beneath. He calls it from up the top, where Amborn, who's the ranger we've already met, and Faramir, Frodo and Sam are watching. A small dark thing dived and vanished just beyond the boil and bubble of the fall, cleaving the black water as neatly as an arrow or an edgewise stone. Now, this is where I got my first little bit of Shakespeare. Boil and bubble. You can't help but hear Macbeth. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire, burn and cauldron bubble. You've got the language of the witches, the idea of a cauldron boiling and bubbling in here. We know that Macbeth was one of the plays that Tolkien read and admired, but also wanted to correct because it influenced his decision for the Ents to march on Saruman. So seeing a little touch of it here, probably it's just because those two words, boil and bubble, have become in everyone's brains a kind of an alliterative moment. But I like to hear a little bit of echo of Shakespeare at this point. Faramir is carrying on being tricky. We talked about how last chapter was all about this kind of duel of wits between Faramir and Frodo, but he's doing it again. He's staging a conversation with Anborn, knowing that Frodo and Sam are overhearing him, saying, "Oh, could it be, could it be a black kingfisher?" That kind of thing. He's probably already decided what it is, but he's waiting to see what Frodo is going to say. And when he gets to the question, shall we shoot it? There's this moment where we get a no from Frodo and a silent yes from Sam. And this marks the different stages they are in their pity journey. Frodo has already decided that Gollum is someone he pities. He remembers the lesson of Gandalf. Sam later on reaches the same point, but at the moment he is not there. And we get Faramir using the word about Gollum, which I've only really ever seen in Tolkien, about Gollum, in fact, which is it's your gangrel companion. Now, gangrel is one of those words that seems to fit really well within Middle-earth, but it's obviously not a common usage word. But we get the idea of what that means. It means Gollum, that kind of lanky, unpleasant creature. Frodo is equally careful. If Faramir is being tricksy, Frodo is equally careful in his reply. For me, this is like they've got a set of cards which they're going to play. And they're working out who wins the hand. And actually, in this case, it's Frodo who wins the hand. Because his trump card is actually what he's here for is fish. Because he lays that down as his last card. And that changes what everybody is thinking about Gollum's motives for being in the pool. And in our situation above this pool, we then get an opportunity to see an almost completely happy Gollum. It's I think it might be almost the only time we see Gollum in his element, doing what he loves most, which is fishing. And of course, he will never be happy because he doesn't have the pressures. But there is a brief sense of him having a holiday from his cares, which is about to turn sour on him. And if he weren't pitying Gollum, it may be something which would, as a reader, make you think about. He is like a child in some ways, a child who has been ruined. So this is when he's at his sort of most childishly happy. And when Faramir asks why they shouldn't shoot this interloper into a forbidden pool, Frodo's answer is twofold. It's an appeal to Gandalf, Mithrandir, who he has taught Faramir as well. But he also is beginning to get a sense of almost like prophetic knowledge, having listened to what Gandalf told him, of course. He says, but this creature is in some way bound up with my errand. This fate of this creature shouldn't be snipped off here because it's going to be going further. Of course, which is correct. Then as Frodo goes down to try and rescue Gollum, though of course Gollum doesn't see it that way, we get overhearing Gollum's own little monologue. We have heard some of these before, particularly Sam overheard an important one where Gollum is trying to make up his mind what to do. But this one is Gollum just basically moaning to himself. And you see how his mind works. It's great. If you listen to the audio version as read by Andy Serkis, as I have, you are in for a treat because it's just very funny, awful and sweet, all those things together. And his brain goes from fish to hobbits to precious to men to fish. What's most interesting about this scene, this little bit of the scene, is Frodo's dilemma. And I think it's a very relatable dilemma because he has a moral choice here. He's thinking, I wish I could get rid of Gollum. Wouldn't life be easier if we just got rid of him? But he reminds himself that a servant has a claim on the master. That's more of an old-fashioned idea now, but I think we can understand what he means. But also, he says Gandalf would not want it remember at this stage he thinks Gandalf is dead, but he's still using Gandalf as his guide to the decisions he makes, which is a very good guide. Another thing we noticed in the earlier chapters, not the last one, but the one before, with Herbs and Stewed Rabbit, is that Sam fell into talking a bit like Gollum. Frodo is doing it here. He's talking about himself in the third person. Master wouldn't like it. Master wouldn't do this. It does seem as though Gollum's speech is almost like an infection. Everyone starts speaking like that around him. But also, I think it gives a sense that Frodo is being his most inauthentic here. He is unhappy that he is playing a role, and so he has to fall into it to be the person that Gollum is expecting and will obey in order to save him. And we get this insight into what he's going through. Frodo, his heart sank. This was too much like trickery. And then a bit further on, what else could he do to keep faith as near as might be with both sides? He's making a compromise. Life in the Shire was relatively simple. Life out in the world is full of such compromises. And I think I really feel for Frodo here, because in a way it's one of these moments that Gollum uses to justify the betrayal in Shelob's lair. We do get a sort of check-in with a visual of Gollum. When Gollum's been taken into the caves and is brought before Faramir, we get a little glimpse of what he looks like. This reminded me that if you haven't described your characters for a very long time, it's a good idea to check back in with them sometimes, with a purpose, and just to keep a sort of in everybody's mind what they look like. Characters can sometimes kind of disappear, particularly if it's a large cast of characters. You think, which one was that? Not that we're going to forget Gollum, but I think it's just, and it makes a point here about the contrast between this shriveled little proto-hobbit and a regal noble man. But anyway, so we've got Gollum in front of Faramir. Gollum blinked, hooding the malice of his eyes with their heavy, pale lids. And a very miserable creature he looked, dripping and dank, smelling of fish. He still clutched one in his hand. His sparse locks were hanging like rank weed over his bony brows. His nose was snivelling. So we got a very physical impression of what this creature now looks like. Faramir obviously asks us a question, which is, why are you here? What are you doing here? In fact, Faramir has a range of questions for him. What is your name? Whence do you come? Whither do you go? What is your business? He doesn't give his name. He doesn't really answer the questions, but he does give a truth, which is more truth than he knows, because he answers by saying, we are lost. Lost. Yeah, Gollum is one of the most lost creatures in literature. He has lost himself, he's lost his ring, he's adrift. Hopeless, a hopeless creature in many ways. But he's a hopeless creature with a bite in more ways than one, because he hits back at the people who are holding him with sarcasm. He sort of says, oh, you're all so wise, they are, so just, so very just. He means the opposite. But he's presenting that he's holding up a mirror to the people around him saying, you think you're so just, well, you've got me here as a prisoner. And of course, that self-righteousness, which he often tries, he's tried it all the way along, doesn't survive, because Faramir has worked out just how bad Gollum has been. He has a way of reading Gollum's heart. And there's an interesting sign of this. We've heard about the greenish light and the light in his eyes of Gollum, which sort of signals a switch between the two sides of his personality. But when Faramir confronts him, we get this. All light went out of them being Gollum's eyes. And they stared, bleak and pale for a moment, into the clear, unwavering eyes of the man of Gondor. It's the moment when all pretense is stripped away. To some ways, Gollum plays both Frodo and Sam. He plays on their pity, he plays on their need for him. I mean, Sam obviously hates it, but even Sam sort of doesn't have the power over him that a Faramir does. He couldn't bring him to this stripped-down version of himself. And Faramir has this very penetrating observation on him. There are locked doors and closed windows in your mind, and dark rooms behind them. Lovely description. And indeed, that gives a great sense of the schema, the deviousness of what is superficially a very pitiable creature. So that's Faramir's dilemma. He's got Frodo and Sam on on one hand, he has Frodo and Sam on one hand who need to carry on with their mission to destroy the ring, and he's got this unreliable guide who they're relying on, and he has to make a decision what to do with them. It's a big decision because it decides the trajectory of the next part of the book. So it's given a line break to underline it. Faramir sat for a moment in thought. And then he says, rather portentously, then I will declare my doom. Doom here is an interesting word because doom means judgment. Doomsday, that idea. But it is in a way Faramir's doom because he knows that he can be blamed by his father for making the wrong decision. So it cuts both ways. Anyway, his declaration is that to Frodo, whomsoever you take under your protection shall be under my protection and the shield of Gondor. I mean, you've got to love Faramir. He goes way beyond just letting these visitors go. He is offering his protection. It's a very sort of chivalric thing to do. And the next stage of that is to ask Frodo if he takes responsibility for Smeagol Gollum. And Frodo agrees in a sort of formal saying, I do take Smeagol under my protection. But what's lovely here is we've got a little dip into Sam, who represents the Shire. Sam sighed audibly, and not at the courtesies of which, as any hobbit would, he thoroughly approved. Indeed, in the Shire, such a matter would have required a great many more words and bows. So, a little nod back to the Shire at all times around Sam. So, when that decision has been made, the next one is about where Frodo is going. And we get a tense exchange between Faramir and Frodo about the path that Gollum has suggested, or is taking them on. He mentions that the path has a name that he knows, which is Cirith Ungol. There's a little note in the companions to the Lord of the Rings saying, why doesn't he mention that means spider? He does say that a dark terror lives there and there's nothing certain in his knowledge about it. I don't know why he doesn't mention it. He knew what Ithil meant earlier. I think probably the answer is Tolkien doesn't want to show his hand too early. So just hint at it, keep it back. I've never thought that before when reading it, so I think it passes the reader by. But Faramir is correct when he goes on to say, to warn that malice eats it, that's Gollum, like a canker, which of course Frodo knows too, but he hopes there's also goodness fighting back, the sort of antibody to that. But the discussion of the path gives Faramir the chance to give a potted history of Minas Ithil, and he also connects it to the 9 riders. Frodo doesn't say, oh yeah, I've met them, I know all about them. It is necessary to have this in this place because it means that the next chapter, when we reach the Morgul Vale, we have already been told the story of this city that fell into darkness. And it also connects us back to the 9 riders of earlier times. And of course, they've become the riders of the winged beasts. So it's just slotting them back to remind us who the external enemies, the ones who leave Mordor, who they are. That's what that all does. It would have been a real digression if Frodo had said, "Oh yeah, I met them up in, I fought them." None of that is necessary here. Move on. So give the connections that are necessary and move on. And what is really true, strikes me as really true about this, is the cleft stick that Frodo finds himself in. So Faramir is saying, don't go that way. It's dangerous. But he hasn't got another way for Frodo to go. He says, well, we don't know all the ways into the land. But Frodo says, yeah, I don't have time to find those. And it's no good saying, what would Mithrandir do? Because he's not here. And it ends up with this cry, but where else will you direct me? And then he goes on to say this absolutely crushing thing. Would you send me to Gondor with the thing that drove your brother mad with desire? That, by the way, comes over extremely well in the BBC audio version of this. That cry, where would you send me? So, yeah, it's a very well done, this scene in that version of this. So Faramir has to bow to the fact that Frodo hasn't really got a choice. If he's going to try and do this thing, he'll have to go away, which they all know is a bad choice. But it's not as if there was another good choice he could make. And in this situation, there's this lovely character note about Faramir. So while he thinks that this is actually likely to end in disaster, he holds out hope. And this teaches you something about optimism. If Tolkien is writing this in the dark days of the Second World War, he didn't know how it was going to end, remember? That's hindsight of history is great. We can say, oh, yes, of course, it's all going to be fine. But he didn't know that. So he had to hope that there was light at the end of the tunnel. And he's giving something to Faramir here, which seems to speak a lot about the experience of the early 40s. So when Faramir says goodnight, he says, if ever beyond hope you return to the lands of the living, and we retell our tales, sitting by a wall in the sun, laughing at old grief, you shall tell me then. This is where I got my other Shakespearean echo here. Laughing at old grief, sitting by telling our tales by a wall is kind of sentiments you find in Shakespearean plays. And it just felt like we were dipping back into, well, in Twelfth Night, Viola talks about smiling at grief. So there's this sort of little hint of Twelfth Night there. Anyway, maybe that I'm just tuning in too much, but I did feel that this had an element of Shakespearean themes in it, this chapter. And Faramir himself seems like a very, he feels almost a Shakespearean character too, one of the most noble lords I'd put him at. And it's very fitting that he makes an actorly exit from this chapter. He rose and bowed low to Frodo, and drawing the curtain, passed out into the cave. So there we are. He leaves with a bow. So that's the end of this chapter. As I said, it was quite short. And we are now going into really take the journey up again and do the onslaught onto getting over those mountains into Mordor in the next chapter, which is called Journey to the Crossroads. So I hope you can join me for that. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers Podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.